The dysentery cases are critical, and 1 in 2 have died. These poor fellows have not had a clean shirt, nor been washed for nearly 2 months. And when they arrive, they can barely walk. Last Thursday, 1,715 wounded arrived, including 120 with cholera. We have not a basin, nor a towel, nor a bit of soap, nor a broom. Everything is lacking.
November 1854, Florence Nightingale had just arrived near Constantinople at a military hospital hastily outfitted to take in wounded British soldiers from the Crimean War. She came from a rich family in Victorian England. Nothing foreshadowed her becoming a nurse, yet she would turn out to be one of the most qualified.
She's one of the greatest people, not just of the Victorian age or the 19th century. She's one of the people who've shaped our modern world.
When she returned from the war, the British cheered her. She had saved lives. She was a heroine.
She achieved so much because she used her influence, she used her power, she used the people that she knew to get things done.
A social reformer and pioneer, she became the international icon of her profession.
Nursing was only a very small part of her oeuvre. She covered public health, epidemiology, social science, architecture, even the arts.
Nurses, midwives, social workers, generations of healthcare professionals have walked in her steps.
I do not pretend to teach women how. I ask them to teach themselves. And for this purpose, I venture to give them some hints.
If you want to change the world for the better, you've got to keep going at it. And young nurses or student nurses or early career nurses have picked up those traits of Florence Nightingale.
She defied her family, doctors, the military, and conservatives of every persuasion in order to make her ideas known. Florence Nightingale chose independence and had the courage to be viewed as a liberated woman. Florence Nightingale would not have become a heroine if she hadn't ventured down the banks of the Bosphorus one November day in 1854. Her fate took a turn in Constantinople as Europe joined forces with the Ottomans in a war of empires. A year earlier, Sultan Abdulmajid I declared war on Russia, which had just sunk part of his fleet. The clash took place between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia wanted access to the straits. The Ottomans were opposed, but lacked the necessary firepower. That is when France and the United Kingdom stepped in to form an alliance with the Sultan to counter Russian ambitions in the great port of Constantinople. 3 empires against 1. The French claimed their involvement in the Crimean War was to protect Christian communities in the Orient and their interests in the region. As for the British, they wanted to maintain control of the Mediterranean Sea. "310,000 French soldiers and 100,000 British soldiers were mobilized. The Allies won a few battles until the siege of Sebastopol, the largest port in Crimea, where the situation worsened.
The problem is that the war lasted. So in September 1854, a siege began that would last 1 year. And a siege like that is the kind of thing that means losses on both sides. Because the armies that were enclosed, and numerous, were often poorly fed and poorly supplied in terms of water. There was very little drinking water in Crimea. Those armies were going to find themselves with rising mortality rates, due mainly to epidemics, particularly typhus.
310,000 French soldiers and 100,000 British soldiers were mobilized. The Allies won a few battles until the siege of Sebastopol, the largest port in Crimea, where the situation worsened. The British were
9/10 of the losses, according to certain statistics, were attributed to typhus rather than battle injuries. Yet there were bombardments, and severe ones at that.
The battles were fierce. Thousands of soldiers, sick and wounded, found themselves trapped by the harsh winter that fell over the Black Sea. For the first time in history, the major British daily, The Times, sent a war correspondent to the front. William Howard Russell made no concessions. He lamented the soldiers left to their fate.
Hear that, Mr. Russell? God help us.
God help us is the cry of the men when they know they are going to the Scutari hospital.
William Howard Russell spent months at the various Crimean fronts. His stories reported everything he saw. Notably, the military hospitals were their scenes of filth and certain death for Her Majesty's subjects.
The Times did an excellent job of reporting. It's the first war that people got news of fairly quickly. It took 10 days by telegraph, as opposed to a ship taking weeks to get the news back.
So the British public, I think, were, at least the middle-class public who were reading the Times, main readership, were, I think, absolutely scandalised. Had it not been for war journalism, actually, then that nothing probably would have happened. That was the main trigger.
Readers will be surprised and angry to learn that no decent preparations have been made for ministering to our soldiers. In our military hospitals, the wounded lie right on the floor itself. They sometimes wait days before receiving first aid. It is an outrage that our soldiers lie dying in such conditions.
Beginning in October 1854, the young Queen Victoria was directly affected by criticism in the press. As sovereign of the United Kingdom, she was head of the armed forces. Her image was tarnished by the high losses amongst her troops. It was a delicate diplomatic affair for the empire, over which she'd held sovereign rule for 17 years. There was public outrage. Voices within the government criticised how the war was being waged. Sidney Herbert, Secretary of State for War, was tasked with putting an end to the bad news making front-page headlines. He turned to a woman he knew well, his close friend, Florence Nightingale. He fought to convince the cabinet to dispatch a group of nurses to tend to the wounded in Scutari, where the largest British military hospital was located, in the outskirts of Constantinople.
There weren't really any other nurses there. There were male attendants, and of course this created a kind of gendered battle from the get-go. War was not a woman's, domain at that time. So it was a big cultural change, an intrusion of women into this male sphere of influence and jurisdiction.
Despite strong opposition to the project, the papers announced the government's decision to send a woman to oversee the care of soldiers in the military hospitals of Turkey. For the first time, the unknown woman's name appeared in the press, Miss Nightingale. After a 3-week journey, she reached the banks of the Bosphorus, leading a group of about 40 women.
The arrival of these first nurses in the field was something new, and up until World War I, it was something that was still taking shape. They had a sort of internalized mission. And of course there was, in the press and in a certain number of circles, a tendency to make fun of them, saying, "Who are these young ladies? What are they going to do over there?" Up until World War I, the status of these women among the men and on the battlefield was always rather ambiguous.
At the time, the nursing profession was in its infancy. For Miss Nightingale and her nurses, the situation was unprecedented. Women had never been on a battlefield before.
But when she got there, she had no idea the extent of the injuries, the number of casualties there were. And when she turned up in this essentially a huge room, the soldiers were all lined up on the floor, no dressings, no sheets, no beds, nothing.
Piled on crude straw mattresses, dying of fever and hunger, the soldiers had little chance of ever seeing England again. Florence Nightingale realized that nothing had been prepared for these soldiers in times of war. The hospital was, in fact, a place to die.
She saw men come in, as I say, with fleas and vermin and excrement in their clothing. I mean, this is appalling. She organized orderlies to take out tubs of feces because they didn't have functioning toilets. Of course she was angry.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 14th of November, 1854. Dear Dr. Bowman, a message came to me to prepare for 570 wounded who are arriving from the dreadful Battle of Balaclava. I always expected to end my days as hospital matron, but I never expected to be a barrack mistress. I take rank in the army as Brigadier General. You gentlemen of England who sit at home in all the well-earned satisfaction of your successful careers can have little idea from reading the newspapers of the horror and misery that reign here. A London hospital is a garden of flowers next to it.
Once she recovered from her shock and anger, Miss Nightingale organized her team of nurses with military discipline. They learned how to tend to patients in emergency conditions and with little means, and grappled with filth and mass contagion.
The nurses were not properly trained nurses. There were very few who were particularly good. There were some who were the exceptions because nursing was a lower class occupation and terrible pay, terrible working conditions. And that was one of Nightingale's missions, was to raise that standard, which started in the Crimean War.
And it took her quite a long time to be able to assert her authority against the military medical men who had held sway before she arrived. It's not a given that this would be a success. Far from it.
Florence was not one to get emotional. In the barracks, she demanded her nurses to exercise restraint and keep their emotions in check.
I cannot allow myself the least careless mistake. There's no room for loose morals or laxness in the barracks. Too many men's lives depend upon it.
If you think about her personality, was she, in today's words, we would probably describe her as an introverted. She would hate any attention. She always shied away from it.
But she had this real sense of identification with people who were much less privileged than herself. So I think that's something to be admired. Because let's face it, she could have done many other things, but she chose a pretty tough life and tough road to take.
My dear friend Sidney Herbert, This morning, I faced the elements and ventured out to the market, a trip I make almost daily, as it's the only way of getting some things. In the hospital, we have no mops, no plates, no knives and forks, no spoons, no scissors for cutting the men's hair, which is practically alive. I'm really cook, housekeeper, washerwoman, and general dealer.
In England, while the government dragged its feet, the Times put out a national call for contributions for the wounded of the Crimea. Donations poured in from all over the country. Boats filled with food and equipment were quickly chartered to Constantinople. Most of the packages were addressed personally to Miss Nightingale.
I think doctors realized that she could get things done. She could do things that their own dreary chain of command, which was horribly complicated and didn't work well, which is another thing she documented in her own report after the war about how disorganized the army was in terms of actually getting the supplies to the right place at the right time.
No soldier deserves to sleep among rats and vermin. To put a stop to the contagion, Florence had the barracks cleaned from top to bottom, ordered additional food, sheets and bedding, drawing from the funds of the Times, as well as her own personal funds. A minor revolution. The laundry room became the nerve centre of the hospital. Here, Miss Nightingale imposed elementary principles, such as clean sheets and dressings, hot water, the best weapons for lowering the mortality rate in the hospital.
It makes sense to us these days, but in the 1850s, this was just not thought about at all.
You need cleanliness, you need clean clothes, and patients feel better when they get them. So that was an absolutely critical change. It's very interesting that Charles Dickens, an important novelist, helped to buy a drying machine. It's all very well to wash the clothing and bedding, but you've got to get them dry.
Her early learning was that people weren't dying of their injuries, they were dying of the infections, and she had to sort out. She also was really insistent on hand washing. She instantly realised that if somebody had an infection, that was going to soon spread across the others. So she had to sort out some prevention, infection prevention and control. So that was what she was instructing people to do in the home. That's really the basis of not hospital care, but also what she was ahead of her time, and nobody really thought about that then.
Hygiene is the main principle for saving lives. In 1854, science had not identified germs and bacteria by name. No one really knew how illnesses spread, but Nightingale relied on her instinct to establish a strict protocol before each treatment.
That was the first, I think, tactic that she deployed, and then built up, cleaning up the barracks and trying to make them into some kind of sanitary state that was acceptable to her. But that must have been just such fiendishly hard work. And it was very slow as well, This didn't happen overnight.
The doctors pointed out how much better off patients were. You need to have all the right environment as well as the actual care with somebody who provides it.
Florence Nightingale's strategy began to pay off. The soldiers' health improved. In the barracks, the mortality rate finally dropped.
The very fundamentals of care, nutrition, hydration, cleanliness, hygiene, putting the patient in the best position for nature to act upon them, which is one of the mantras and aphorisms of Nightingale care, was really to the fore.
But it wasn't enough. Caring for patients also means looking after their mental well-being and breaking their solitude. Miss Nightingale set up periods devoted to writing and reading letters.
These poor fellows bear pain and mutilation with unshrinking heroism. I heard one man say, "I was dreaming of my friends at home."
We know that she certainly wrote letters back to relatives about soldiers who were kind of dying and connecting people and families that way.
Sometimes the family sent that letter to a newspaper, and so those letters appeared. And you can imagine, I mean, just what enormous pleasure people would get. The commander, the person's commanding officer, didn't write letters. She was doing something that the British Army didn't do, and families appreciated it.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 12th of April, 1855. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cope, I'm very sorry to have to communicate to you the illness of your poor son. He was admitted and immediately attended to by surgeons, by one of my nurses and myself. He wished very much to have a letter written to you, and 2 or 3 times I went to him for the purpose, but he was always too weak and put it off. He often murmured, "Dear, dear mother," and tried to say many things to you.
In Great Britain, the young Florence Nightingale became an icon, a sort of angel who watched over the kingdom's soldiers. From then on, she became known as the famous Lady with a Lamp. The nickname would follow her whole life. And yet, it was not on the Crimean front that her vocation was born, but long before the war, while she was still very young.